I'm not feeling the same way as I am right now. And I know full well that this might not be a very popular opinion or a popular take, but I'm just going to go out and say it, Dibs. Leading up to the All-Star break, I wasn't rooting for the Giants to win baseball games.
That's crazy. That's crazy. That to me is spoken from a guy who's not a real fan. If you're rooting against your team, and I know why you were doing it. You were doing it because you wanted them to sell and you wanted them to try and get better for next year, but that to me is cutting off your nose to spite your face. That's not real fan talk. And
it makes me feel bad.
Disappointed to hear that. Disappointed.
It makes me feel bad. I don't want to feel that way, but it's the way I felt. The way I approached this going into the trade deadline. I was not of the opinion that this Giants team, as presently constructed, was good enough to make a legitimate run. And before I even dive further into this, if you want to call me an idiot, call me not a Giants fan, call me a fair weather fan, call me whatever you want, say you're on Dibs' side, whatever. Give us a call, 888-957-9570. That's also the Xfinity mobile text line. We'll go to all your opinions, even if you want to call me names. Just keep it clean, or otherwise you won't be able to call back into the radio station. So, leading up to the All-Star break, Dibs, I wasn't terribly confident that this was going to be a Giants team that was going to be able to put together a run. So, for me, if I'm not believing that that's even really much of a possibility, I would rather begin to look towards next season, as painful and as difficult as that is, because I feel like in the Farhan Zaidi era, the only thing that we've been promised around the deadline every single year is the promise of next year. This year, for me, hasn't really felt any different. But the other issue is the Giants haven't really made any moves to actually set themselves up for more success in the future when it comes to deadline moves. They've either just stood pat or they've done kind of some minor buying-ish. They haven't really done a lot of selling and getting rid of some assets to help yourself in the future. Now, to Farhan Zaidi's, I don't know if this is a credit or, disservice, they haven't really had a lot of high-priced assets to sell and get something big in return. Maybe that's part of the issue overall, but I didn't think that was going to happen this year, that they were going to be able to compete. And I was concerned if the Giants entered the deadline the way they were, which was kind of a coin flip. Well, we could make a run. Oh, we might not be able to make a run. I wasn't confident that they were going to make, leadership was going to make what I thought was the right decision. And in my opinion, the right decision was sell Blake Snell, sell Robbie Ray, sell Matt Chapman, get something back for three guys that might opt out and you might be left with nothing. Like the worst case scenario is if you miss the postseason and all those guys opt out and you're left with nothing for any of them. And I know this is doom and gloom and, well, that might not happen. They might make the playoffs and maybe one of these guys opts in and then you're looking silly for arguing the way that you're arguing right now. Okay, that very well might happen. But I was concerned that the Giants would not be able to make that decision, bring themselves to make that decision if they were kind of in a coin flip in the middle of a postseason race.
I get that. Yeah, but
So I wanted them to lose, so they would be forced to sell and build for the future. Finally, just put an end to this nonsense, to this mediocrity, and actually build something for the future instead of just standing pat and doing nothing.
It's wild because when you think about like 2010, 12, and 14, they were never the best team in those postseasons, and yet they got in and they went on a run and they were able to win the World Series. And you look at Arizona last year, they were not the best team. They had to fight and scratch and claw to be a wild card team. And then they went on a run and they got to the World Series. They didn't win it. But Texas, for their part, same thing. They were not a dominant team in the regular season, yet they got in, they went on a run, and they actually did win the World Series. So thinking about the Rocky series last week where they had 4 games at home, were you hoping they lost all 4?
I was hoping they didn't sweep.
You were hoping that
I was hoping they didn't.
Were you hoping they got swept? Because if they got swept,
they would have no doubt sold.
It would have been crystal clear, exactly. And Farhan might not have survived the deadline.
If that's what it would have taken to get them to sell, yes, I was rooting for it.
But instead, they did sweep, and then they came out and they split with Oakland. So you're right, a 5-1 homestand, which is one game away from. It looks great, even though it's Colorado and Oakland. Whatever, FP would tell us that these are pro teams, and you don't ever look at what happened, and you don't ever look at those results and think, oh boy, of course we should have won. You won 5 of 6, and so you're no closer to being in the race than you were before those games came up. But if you would have gone 1-5, well, then you would have been about 8 games out, and then you definitely could have been much more of a seller at the deadline. So I get that part of it.
I also just can't wrap my head around the possibility that sweeping the Colorado Rockies over a 4-game homestand at home changed their plans. If that changed their plan, Dibs, sweeping one of the worst teams in baseball, and I get FP's point that you just brought back up. Like, these are all professional players. Okay, whatever. They're the worst professional team in baseball. One of them. Okay, the Chicago White Sox are the worst team in baseball, but the Colorado Rockies are not that far behind. If sweeping that 4-game series right before the trade deadline was enough to really change the direction that you were planning on going at the deadline, oh man, that is such a terrible miscalculation. You have all year beaten up on the Colorado Rockies and been subpar against nearly everybody else. You can't possibly let that change your opinion, which is why I just so desperately wanted it to bottom out early so they would be forced. You couldn't even look at this team and have a realistic opinion that this team was going to go somewhere. I hope I'm proven wrong, because now that the deadline's gone, Dibs, and there's nothing that I can do about it, nothing that anyone can do about it. This is the roster for the rest of the season. You can't sell Blake Snell. You're just going to have to hope he pitches well, or maybe he pitches poorly and therefore opts in, or pitches well and wants to re-sign, or pitches well and leads you to a postseason berth. Whatever the case is, now I'm back on. There's nothing I can do about it now. I want them to win and go to the postseason.
Yes.
I still think it's very unlikely, but that's not how I felt a week ago.
Right, and do you feel bad, and do you feel a little dirty about the fact that you wanted them to lose a week ago and now you're all of a sudden
feel good.
back in?
It did not feel good, no doubt.
It's a little bit of a schadenfreude where you are like rooting against yourself. It's a little bit of that level of self-hatred, and then you get through the deadline, and now all of a sudden you're all in on the Giants doing well, and so
I don't have a choice now.
Right, and you had a choice then, but I would argue you made the wrong choice, because you want them to win and do well now, because you don't know what the future holds. And yes, Snell could opt out, and Ray could opt out, and Chapman, they all could opt out, or they could go on a little bit of a run. And you've got Snell and Ray pitching, and you've got Chapman, a great defensive third baseman who can provide some hitting at times, and maybe you have a spot here over the next week or even 10 days. You've got Cincy, Washington, and Detroit. Those are all winnable games, and maybe you go 8-2, and all of a sudden, you wake up and you've got Atlanta coming in again, and you find yourself a game and a half out of the wild card, or a game out, and all of a sudden you're right there.
Yeah,
it's possible,
and I'm in on that now, because
now you are.
There's not a deadline coming up next Tuesday.
Right,
there's nothing they can do about it. This is their team.
Yeah,
I don't want the worst case scenario to happen now, because there's nothing you can do about it. If the worst case is now you struggle, you miss the postseason, Snell pitches well enough to opt out, Robbie Ray pitches well enough to opt out, but they don't lead you to a postseason berth. Maybe Chapman ends up opting out. They all sign elsewhere, and now you're looking at the incredibly successful offseason you had, finally being able to sign free agents. The only one that would still be on your roster beyond one season was the guy who hurt his shoulder in May and hasn't played since May.
Yeah, that's less than desirable. I admit that. And if that's the way this goes, then you're probably going to have a new president of baseball ops. And if you get to the offseason and you wind up 79-83 or whatever the Giants record typically is. And
right around there.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe you're 81-81 and you wind up 4 games out of the wild card, whatever the number is. And Snell realizes that, he didn't love the way that the Giants tried to rush him back. And so he's out. And Robbie Ray's thinking, damn, I'm finally healthy. I can make more than $25 million, so I'm out. And Chapman's thinking, geez, I want to go somewhere where I can actually hit home runs, and so I'm out. If all those things happen and you're left with a bunch of young guys and Logan Webb, well, then, yeah, you're probably looking at a completely new direction. That's not ideal.
So let's at least make it worth it.
Yeah,
let's at least make what they did at the deadline worth it, and go out there and at least fight for a freaking postseason berth and hopefully make it and see what happens after that.
And it starts tonight with their new acquisition, Mark Canha in the 2-hole.
Oh, God.
Let's go, Canha.
I mean, the lineup features Mark Canha. It features Gerard Encarnacion not making his MLB debut, but making his Giants debut. It features Casey Schmidt. That's your lineup.
Yeah, young players, and I think it might be Harar, but we'll have to await confirmation.
Like right on Hispanic pronunciations.
Exactly, but of all the Encarnacions, he's probably not the one that you would think that
No.
that you would eventually have. And I didn't even know he was in the organization, which is, more typical Farhan moves than ever before. You bring up a guy who most people hadn't heard of a day ago, and now he's immediately in the lineup.
Yeah, he came up with the Marlins, got his MLB debut with them a couple of years ago in 2022, played 23 games, hit 182. But if you look at, if you're into checking in on the farm, what he's been doing in Sacramento, his season has actually been really interesting, but he's been tearing the cover off the ball in AAA this year, hitting 352, 10 home runs, 33 RBIs in 33 games.
Okay.
An RBI a game, and he's hitting 352. See if he continues that. But, I mean, the last couple of games for the Giants offense, pretty dang ugly. 2 runs against Oakland in a loss. You didn't really score anything until the very end of the game when you were already down relatively big. And then you just eke across 1 run on Wednesday to back Logan Webb's complete game shutout. And it was on a sac fly. Didn't even get a hit to drive in a run in that game, and you won the game. The offense has got to get things going.
No doubt.
Otherwise, there's no chance, even if this offense, as Farhan says, or this pitching staff, as Farhan says, is the best in baseball. If you don't score many runs, it ain't going to matter.
Well, and if you're looking at a place to do that, Cincinnati would be the spot to go ahead and get your offense heated up because it's one of the easiest hitting ballparks in Major League Baseball. So, yeah, you're coming off 3 runs in 2 games, but you did get 1 win, and you've got 3 games in Cincinnati, pending weather. Hopefully you can get all 3 of those games in and, heat up the bats and give your pitchers a little bit more of a cushion.
But I think that you're right in all of that. I'm trying to get to why I'm even feeling the way, why I felt the way I felt. And it was I was rooting for the Giants to lose games leading up to the trade deadline because I wanted them to be forced to sell. And I'm just trying to come to the conclusion of how I even got to that point. And it's something that we talked about earlier in the week with FP when he was in with us Monday through Wednesday. And it was how prideful, and historic this Giants organization is. And I haven't really felt that same kind of aura around the franchise and around the team for the last couple of years. And I can't believe I was anywhere close to a point where I was even considering thinking, well, maybe the Giants losing could be the best thing for the organization. Like, this isn't coming from a position of they've lost me as a fan. I hate them now. I want Farhan out. Down with the Giants. I'm now going to be a San Diego Padres fan. Like, that's not where this is coming from.
Right.
This is still coming from a place of me being a gigantic Giants fan. I think the best thing for the organization and the future of the organization would have been selling your pieces and getting as much as you can to help out in the future. And I think we look at the idea of selling at the deadline, Dibs. We look at it as like the comparison of what the Spurs did to get Victor Wembanyama. We think it's similar to tanking in the NBA. I don't think so. Maybe it's not necessarily going to help you win baseball games down the stretch of that year when you do sell. That would kind of be counterintuitive. But it's not as if the idea about selling at the deadline is to get a better draft pick in baseball. Like, you're not actively trying to lose baseball games. You're just trying to, as FP would put it, acquire value and get value into your organization.
But mostly that value is going to be value for next year or the year after. I don't know if you could have gotten value for this year, so it does feel a little bit like, the NBA model of a punt. And in the NBA, you go out and you try to get a lottery pick, and that lottery pick, a lot of times, like Victor Wembanyama, can come in and be impactful. He came in at 18 or 19 years old, and he immediately was their best player, and it didn't lead them to being better than they were the year before. I think they won 22 games each of the last 2.
The future is way more bright now.
The future is way more bright. And you've got a guy at the major league level in the NBA.
Yeah, the immediate future is bright.
Exactly.
Brighter.
And also the distant future, knowing that he's a guy who's going to be a real good NBA player at 7'5" and all the rest of it. So if you do that in baseball, it's a lot more of a question mark. Like, you're going to get a prospect, and you don't know if that prospect is going to come up and be any good now or later. So it's a little bit tougher to be in sell mode and also tell your fans that, hey, we're still in this window where we're trying to win. And I think that's the hardest part for the Giants right now is They spent all that money, and your young guys are now up. Schmidt and Luciano and Matos and Ramos and Bailey and Doval and, Webb to an extent. You do have a young core of guys who are ready to be major leaguers, so you don't want to just make them wait another year or two while the next group of young guys comes up. So I do think it's tougher to sell for the Giants now than it would have been a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I do think, though, say you went out and you traded Blake Snell and you traded Robbie Ray, and maybe you considered Chapman, or maybe you held on to Chapman because maybe you think he has the most likely to opt in, or whatever the case is. But maybe you move off of Conforto or Yaz or both, or whatever the situation is. Maybe you get a decent offer for Lamont and you consider that, whatever it is. You take all those prospects that you got, because no one's going to be giving you major league ready, current major league players for those guys. Or if they are, they're going to be, back end of the bench guys. So they're not going to be anything for the future. But you do that to replenish your farm system, Dibs. And if you are confident that they're going to be future stars, okay, maybe they're worth investing in and developing and waiting 5 years until they come up and start helping your baseball team. Maybe. But what you can also do is use those pieces you just got, those farm hands you just got, and go out and use those, or at least make you more willing, because you now have a deeper farm system, to go out and trade for someone in the offseason or trade for someone at next season's deadline. Part of the reason why the Giants, I think, have fallen behind so many other teams, like the Padres are a great example of this. The Dodgers as well. The Dodgers farm system hasn't been as great lately, but they're perfect examples of this. They have consistently been developing top-end talent that sometimes comes up and helps them in the major leagues, but also they're just developing enough of those guys that they feel like they're able to ship away a couple of them and their farm system will still ultimately be okay because they have depth there. The Giants don't have that kind of depth. How do you get that depth? Hopefully you draft well. That's kind of a longer way to do it, but you can also move off of some of your veteran pieces now who might not be contributing to a team that's going to win anytime soon, potentially, and then flip those pieces to get more proven major leaguers who are under longer-term deals. And you could do that in the offseason. You could do that next trade deadline. You could do that next May if you wanted to.
Yeah, you can do it in the winter.
But maybe your depth just isn't strong enough right now to where you feel like you're comfortable giving up your 8th best prospect because your prospect list is already so much weaker than everybody else.
Well, and also you went all in on this year, and so you went all in on Snell and Ray and Soler, who you've now traded, and you went all in on Chapman and Jung-Hoo Lee. You signed to a long-term deal. So I do think that what you're saying makes sense, but not for this year and this team and this situation with Farhan Zaidi, who's got 2 more years under contract, but really it feels like this year is kind of a make or break for, the future of his job with the Giants. So you went all in, and when you go all in, you can't get to the deadline and suddenly go all out. And if you do, well, you'd better have the security of knowing that you're going to be able to be the guy here to rebuild it for another year or two. So I do think that based on Farhan's contract and you have a new manager and where you were this year, you kind of went for it this year. You spent over the tax and you brought in all these high-priced guys again, and you did it last year, and those guys didn't work out, and so you rebooted it, and you brought in more players this year, and so you're kind of pot committed, I think, on the guys you brought in. And yeah, Snell could opt out, and Ray could opt out, but in the meantime, they also might be able to help you get into the wild card and help you go on a run, which I think would solve everything for Farhan Zaidi.
I hope you're right. I hope they get into the wild card.
I do too, and I think that this next week becomes, as big as the last week, and we talked about the stretch before the deadline, and then the deadline happened and nothing really took place. You got Mark Canha and you shipped out some pieces, and now coming out of the deadline, you've got these 7 games on the road. You've been a bad road team, but you've got Cincinnati. You got Snell going tonight, and Snell's been amazing. So you figure tonight's a game that you would expect to win. You've got 4 in Washington. Those are games you should win. You'd like to think over the next week, you come out of it 5-2 with a little bit of momentum heading down the stretch.
What do you think the FanGraphs Giants make the playoffs odds are at this stage?
Probably about the same, about 17%.
11.4.
Even lower, wow.
So it was 17 after the sweep of the Rockies.
Yep.
Just before the trade deadline. I guess right at the deadline it was 17%. Then they lost to the A's on Tuesday night. And that night is when everyone around the Giants in the wild card race won. The 6 teams ahead of them and the 1 team behind them won. Their odds fell from 17.5 to like 10%. So it dropped like 7% after one day of baseball games. One day in a 162-game season dropped their odds, according to Fangraphs, by about 7%. Now the win, a couple of other days, an off day yesterday, a couple other teams around you in the standings lost, is up to 11.4%. The Giants' current postseason odds. That sounds about right to me.
Yeah, that's a 1 in 9 chance, which is not great, but
go on a 9-1 run, and then that chance will.
Or even if you go 5-2 on this trip, and it's all about winning series now. You win a series in Cincinnati, you win the series in Washington, you come home, you have Detroit, you win that series. Maybe you wind up going 7-3 in the next 10, and you feel like you have a little bit of a better chance as you get down the stretch.
What are the odds you think those three guys that we're talking about are opting out at the end of the year? Blake Snell, Robbie Ray, Matt Chapman. They all essentially have player options. Some of them are a little more complex and convoluted than others. I think Robbie Ray has 2 more years on his potential deal. Chapman, similar. I would imagine Blake Snell, almost no matter what, it seems like Blake Snell is going to be opting out.
Everyone thinks so. And I mean, if he pitches like this down the stretch, then you would imagine that he would. But he's making $32 million, and he's got $32 million next year. So depends on what he wants to do with his agent. Because last year he went with Scott Boras, and how'd that work out for you? It didn't work out well. You signed very late into spring, and you came in and you weren't healthy, you weren't ready, and you got hurt twice. And so if he fires his agent, then I think he's going to opt out. That's my read on it. If he keeps his agent, I think that he opts in.
Interesting. It is kind of weird how you try to figure out what the market is going to be for Blake Snell, and you wonder, well, yeah, if he pitches great the final 2 months of the year, he's probably due for a nice payday. He came off a Cy Young award last year, and he ended up taking this deal with the Giants. And again, maybe part of it was the Scott Boras impact, and he was encouraging his guys to wait and wait and wait and wait. The offer you want is going to come, trust me, and then just never came. Maybe they'll learn from that experience, even if Scott Boras stays as his agent through this coming offseason. But if he didn't get the offers that he was asking for last offseason, even if he pitches great to close this season, why would he get him now? He had a much better season last year, almost no matter what happens these final 2 months.
Completely. And he is going to be 32 in December. So you get to that point where, you might think about opting out and get that last 4-year deal. Yeah. Maybe you get 4 years and 120, which would be $30 million a year, which would be a little bit of a pay cut, but at least you get 4 years guaranteed. I think it depends on what you think the market is going to be out there. If I'm Blake Snell and I'm looking to opt out, I'm looking at just a 4 or 5 year deal. Not no matter what the money is, but just get me like 125 guaranteed for 5 years and I'm good. Instead of having to go through what he went through last year.
Yeah, it's almost kind of, I guess, maybe kind of like a Brandon Ayuk situation where if you don't try to get the extension done now or you don't get it done, and in Snell's case is if you don't opt out and get the long-term contract now, you're also going through a whole nother season where there's a chance you could get seriously injured, and maybe that hinders the rest of your career in this league anyway.
True.
So maybe it's taking a little bit of a risk too if he even opts in. Decent payday now, but anything beyond this season, it's up to him being healthy next year.
And that's the Robbie Ray thing, I think even more so the idea of injury, because he's coming off the Tommy John. So if he puts 10 good starts together, he might be looking for that last guaranteed payday coming off an injury.
True. Yeah. All right, we got to hit a break here on Willard and Dibs. 888-957-9570 if you want to yell at me for saying I was rooting for like a week for the Giants to lose some games so they would be forced to sell at the deadline. We also got to change gears and get into the Niners. Patrick Willis is headed to the Hall of Fame. He will be enshrined in Canton tomorrow. It's going to be quite a sight. I'm sure very emotional for him. Jim Harbaugh is chartering a plane to get out to Canton for him and a couple of Patrick Willis's former teammates, including Navarro Bowman. I'm sure that's going to be an awesome flight. Jim Harbaugh with some old Niner buddies. That's going to be a lot of fun. And we're talking with Aldon Smith, one of those teammates of Patrick Willis. That's coming up in an hour at 4 o'clock here on Willard and Dibs. We're presented by Fremont Bank, celebrating 60 years of full-service banking with no compromises. It's Dibs and Grandy with you. More coming up next on 95.7 The Game.